to Out of the Fog. I'm Melissa Royle. The results of the 2019 federal election are in, and there's lots to talk about. Joining us tonight, we have Jack Harris, the MP-Elect from St. John's East, and the founders of a new podcast called Podco, love the name. That's Dr. Lee Oates, Dr. Lucian Ashworth, and Dr. Stephen Tomblin. So stay tuned, we'll be right back with those guests.
You're watching Rogers TV, St. John's.
Looking for great seats to all the action? Rogers Super Sports Pack delivers. With NBA League Pass, get up to 40 out-of-market games every week, all season long. More dunks, more slams, more to love, live in HD. NBA League Pass, part of the Rogers Super Sports Pack. All this for only $35.95 a month. Order through your remote on channel 431 or call 1-888-ROGERS-1 today.
Welcome back to Out of the Fog. I'm delighted to be here with the MP-Elect for St. John's East, Jack Harris.
Hi, Melissa.
Congratulations on your victory last night.
Thank you very much. It was very satisfying, frankly. I was quite delighted and wish to thank the voters of St. John's East for their, giving their confidence in me to represent them. So I'm very honored and very privileged.
And how does it feel to be going back? I mean, you served a couple of terms in Ottawa for this riding, defeated the last time, and now back to, I guess, finish what you started. How does it feel to win after that history?
It feels great. I mean, it's a transition, obviously. I had to transition out of being an MP. This is a much easier transition
Sure.
and a much more pleasant one, I have to say. Going from being a member of Parliament and, ready to keep on and ready, in our case, we were hoping to form a government the last time. And then to have that change all of a sudden in the last week or 10 days of the campaign, it was a bit of a shock and quite a transition out of that because you get used to being what you are. I'd been there for 7 years and was very engaged and very involved, and I was a official opposition defense critic. I was the vice chair of the defense committee. It was a very interesting time, an exciting time. So to transition out of that was not easy, but I'm very delighted to be going back, and I very much enjoyed the job. People would ask me, did I miss it? I said, yes, of course. It was the best job I ever had. So I don't know. Every parliament is different. This one is going to be interesting and exciting as well because we do have a minority government. When we have a program that's, I'm very much behind what we stood for in the election campaign. We had it was 109 pages, so there's a lot of material in it, but the highlights are well known and the things that we've emphasized here. So they'll be our priorities, and I think with a minority government, the opportunity of seeing some of those priorities met is much greater. So I'm excited by it and looking forward to it.
And we'll come back to some of those issues in a minute, but going back to this campaign versus the last one, is there anything that you think you did differently in this election, or did you learn any lessons from the last one? What was the secret to your success this time?
Well, I don't know if there was any secret to success in either one. I mean, I know in the last election, I was burdened, in a sense, by the pundits all saying, oh, Jack is going to get elected, and people were taking up that chorus. And in fact, one of the big prognosticators, this Eric Grenier, CBC, 338.com, now it's called, that I had a 98 or 99% chance of winning. I wish he had never said that because, it meant that some of our people thought that they were better, some of our best volunteers and activists thought their time was best spent trying to help St. John's South Mount Pearl instead of working in St. John's East.
Take your victory for granted kind of
thing.
Yeah,
that Jack didn't need my help, etc. And in fact, I'm sure there were numbers of people who didn't actually vote because they thought that they didn't need to bother because he didn't need my vote. I've heard that from numbers of people. So there was a lot of different issues that were there in terms of motivation. So I guess one of the lessons, if there is one, would be that you have to ensure that your voters are motivated, that the people who are New Democrats that do want to support you actually get out to vote. So we had a very strong organization. This time we made it clear we weren't taking any chances. We recruited heavily volunteers. We canvassed as much, well, we always canvass as much as you can, but the more people you have doing it, the more coverage there is. After all, there's 44,000 households in St. John's East.
Big riding, lots of communities.
You can't possibly get to them all. And for a candidate, you can knock on, you can knock on 1,000 doors and half of the people aren't home, or two, more than that, and at different times a day, and it takes a long time to do that. So I spent a fair bit of time doing things that sounds a little silly, but going to a supermarket and shaking hands with people as they go in or go out and saying hello and introducing yourself. And, in my case, thankfully, most people actually didn't say, who's that weird guy trying to stop me? I want to go shopping. They did recognize me, but I was able to make voter contact. People who were say, well, I voted for you last time, or I'm voting for you, or if they said I voted for the last time, I'm not sure, well, then you'd have an opportunity at least to give them the 30-second pitch of saying why that there's a good reason to vote again for the NDP or for me. And so it was a great experience. I mean, I enjoyed it very much. I probably did more of that this election than I did the last time, because we were knocking on doors, we were doing all that. But there seemed to be a greater urgency because, there was an incumbent now. I hadn't run against an incumbent federally before, frankly. The first time I ran was a by-election, so there was no incumbent. The second time, there was no incumbent because Norman Doyle had resigned as a member of Parliament, so the field was open to...
And then you were the incumbent.
And then I was the incumbent. So it's, it's my 5th federal election, but it's all been very interesting.
And of course, in addition to the ground game, the national campaign, of course, plays a big role in how the results turn out. Jagmeet Singh and the federal NDP had a, kind of a long shot at having big electoral success this election, going from the polls and the punditry at the beginning of the election. Then, of course, around the debates, I think is when it was, Jagmeet Singh delivered, I think, a pretty solid performance, and then we started to see the polls for the NDP start to go up. How encouraged were you by that? And do you think that played a role as well? Oh,
I'm sure it did. I mean, we had early days strategy, months and months ago. We didn't know what everyone talks about the ballot question. What are people going to be asking themselves when they go to the polls,
Sure.
And way back then, several months ago now, we thought that the best question to ask, since the last election was very close, was to, who do you want to send to Ottawa to represent you? We had a situation where we knew that Mr. Trudeau had disappointed a lot of people after so much promise that was given in the last election, so much excitement, frankly, that he had generated across the country, the wave that took every seat in the Atlantic, and including St. John's East. Well, that was a concern, but so we had to do what we had to do to plan an election. The narrative about the NDP was not very good. The media was talking about, we might be wiped out. The same as we heard in the provincial election, we might lose our party status, or the Greens were going to take our place as third party. Well,
and then they gained seats.
That didn't happen, obviously. But that's what it was until the election started. And then people saw Jagmeet Singh. They didn't really see him before. They heard about him because the media was saying, this is terrible things going on. And we had this ridiculous situation in New Brunswick where people were, all kinds of false news going on.
Where some people switched to the Green Party.
Yeah, they were all going to join the Green Party. Well, ultimately, they did elect one person, which is fine. But it wasn't the wholesale abandonment that was claimed, and it was half the people who were supposedly jumping to the Greens that said, but no one asked me about that. So it's kind of,
sure.
Lots of these things bad things were happening before, nothing to do with us. But when Jagmeet Singh started getting airtime, when people saw him when the election's called, the media has to give equal time, so people saw more of him. When the debate took place, there was a big contrast between the kind of a nasty pointing fingers at each other between Andrew Scheer and Justin Trudeau, and that went on quite heavily. And Jagmeet Singh showed himself to be different than that. He had a different take, he had a different tone, he was very articulate, he was very authentic, he was very personable. He even maintained his sense of humor in a place which is very hard to do, the tension of that. So he showed leadership qualities that people warmed to, and I think a lot of young people warmed to him as a result of that and other things. And not only young people, but all generations and all political parties. I saw an amazing analysis, it was actually a survey, that the approval rating of, they have this approval rating versus disapproval. You subtract one from the other, like him or don't or dislike him. And he rose not only amongst young people, but all generations and all political persuasions. He rose in the estimation of so many people. So that was a bit of a lift, and that helped.
And now, of course, the NDP has a significant amount of power now, as holding the balance of power in a minority government. And I know Jagmeet Singh has come out with a list of priorities that he thinks that he would like to hold the Liberal government to in order to continue to support them. But what do you think kind of the top priorities are? What do you think that the NDP is really going to, how they're going to be able to affect change in legislation coming in this minority?
Well, I think it's been suggested that we may have more influence on this parliament with 24 seats than we did in the last one with 44, and I think that's probably true. Well, we have, I mean, Jagmeet has enunciated the priorities, and they're ones that people heard of. Obviously, pharmacare is one, dental care is another one, which I think is very important to this province. We're very interested in housing, and the student debt is something that's also caught on. I mean, that's a big problem for young people. We want to get rid of the interest on student loans, existing ones and future ones, to make it easier for people to transition, young people to transition from being a student to actually having a life and building a future. Also, childcare. So they're the kind of things that people are used to associating with the New Democrats, and we want to see and housing is another. But those are important issues that we will see. The promises were made by the Liberals during the election too, lots of them. So we're anxious to see that the promises that were made by the Liberals, the offers that we made if we would form government, that some of them actually get done. They don't just stay there as promises like pharmacare for the last 20 years, which we've seen the Liberals get away with.
Or electoral reform.
Electoral reform is very important. Well, this election is a classic reason why you have to have electoral reform. We had 2 weeks of the two leading parties vying for 32% of the vote. Well, they all wanted to get to 38% of the vote so they'd have 100% of the power. That's the problem with that. Right. And they were doing that because that's the system that we have. It doesn't have to be that way. The people of Canada rejected that, and they said, well, pox on both of your houses. We want people to cooperate. So the result was that we have a parliament which says that you have to cooperate or you can't govern.
And in addition to the national issues, what issues that are kind of localized to your riding or to Newfoundland and Labrador in general? I know you had a number of critic positions and were had a big profile on a number of issues for this province when you were in the last time. Is there any unfinished business that you are looking forward to getting back to? Well,
I think there was one thing that I did spend a lot of time when I was in Parliament before as defence critic, was the search and rescue response times. Now, we got the base back in St. John's, which is important. We got lifeboat stations in parts of Newfoundland where they weren't before. But we do need to still work on the search and rescue response times. Nothing has really been done on that in the last 4 years. That was something that I was involved in. But I mean, obviously, we've got issues now with the rate mitigation and other big issues for the province that have to be looked at. And Jagmeet Singh responded to the letter that the Premier wrote and with the priorities of the province in a very strong way. And these are things that I want to take up as well. I spoke to the Premier today. He called me to congratulate me. And, I'm certainly anxious to help in any way I can with the province's priorities. And I guess, once again, with the minority government, the ability to do that may be improved.
And Jagmeet Singh actually spent some time here growing up. Do you think having that kind of perspective can help make sure that we have someone else in our corner here?
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, he's an almost Newfoundlander. He was only 2 or 3 when he came here. The brother and sister born here. He hung out in Boring Park and lived in Grand Falls for a time. So he does have an affection for the province. I think that's important, and therefore also a real desire to ensure that he understands and is willing to work with the province's priorities in Parliament, and I think that's a great thing.
And speaking of that regionalization, we're just about out of time, but I realize that you're the only NDP elected to all of Atlantic Canada. In fact, do you feel any kind of responsibility to, I guess, stand up for issues related to the whole region?
Well, I think I've been there before. When I was first elected, I was the only New Democrat east of Oshawa, I believe. We now have, one in Quebec and one in Newfoundland and Labrador before you get to Ontario. So that's kind of unique. Well, I think, I did play that role a little bit before. But I think there's something to do with that, but you can't do everything, It's very important that we have more than one voice in Newfoundland and Labrador to advocate in Ottawa, and not just the same party, everyone in the same party. So that's important, and I'll be working on that. And we don't know what critic area I'll have yet. I've had several critic areas, defense and justice, public safety, etc. So it's we'll see what shakes down, but it's guaranteed to be interesting.
Well, when we get your critic portfolio sorted out, we'll have you back and chat about that.
That'd be great.
Congratulations again, and thank you so much for joining us on what I'm sure is a busy day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. We'll be right back with more Out of the Fog.
All right, girls.
Mom, you said it's played again.
Workplace injuries hurt the most at home.
My husband is a wonderful man and a great father when he's not drinking. I'm so angry he chooses alcohol over us. If he really loved us, he'd stop drinking, right? My counselor suggested I try Al-Anon. I didn't understand why. I'm not the one with the problem, but I'm glad I went. Do you worry about someone's drinking? You are not alone. Al-Anon or Alateen can help. Call 866-200-0033 or visit alanon.org/hope.
Welcome back to Out of the Fog. I'm here with Dr. Steve Tomblin, Dr. Luke Ashworth, and Dr. Lee Oates, all the founders of a brand new political podcast. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
So where'd you get the idea to start a podcast on politics coming right here from St. John's?
Well, I think it almost started out as a group therapy project for political scientists. I had written an opinion piece on the idea that we need to get more serious about democratic reform. And I think Luke probably picked it up on Twitter and wrote me and said, yeah, we got to have coffee about this. And we got to invite Steve too. And yeah, we just started brainstorming on ideas on what we could do. And I think the first one that came up was a conference. It was like, no, academics always have conferences.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
Not enough. No.
We're in this kind of
Let's have a workshop.
yeah, we're in this golden age of communications, so we decided to work with the university radio station to produce our own podcast.
Yeah.
Produce our own skills.
You
Develop
produce them
our new
yourselves.
skills.
Whoa, old dogs, new tricks. I won't go there. But sharing your knowledge and your expertise with the public is kind of, it seems like it's part of being a university professor or a scholar and academic. But a podcast is kind of a whole new realm. It kind of is the opposite of what we think of as academic publishing. You're squirreled away in your office, working on projects with a lot of specificity for a long time, peer review, that whole process. You're going to have to be a bit more off the cuff on the podcast. Going to be a bit more, out there with your opinions, off the cuff. How does this? How do you feel like that's going to go for you?
Well, actually, it's becoming more and more common now. A lot more academics are doing it, and that's particularly because the publishing now is taking longer and longer. Mainly because the peer review is becoming more and more rigorous. And actually, a lot of people now, a lot of academics are taking to doing blogs and podcasts. So we aren't actually alone here.
We like to banter.
And we like to banter.
And we've lost that capacity and ability for bantering in public.
You can learn a lot from bantering.
You all come from a political science or history or combination thereof background, but I mean, to have some banter, you got to have some difference of opinions, some different perspectives. What are each of you bringing to the table from your own professional and personal experiences?
My background is in political science and history. So I have 2 degrees in, I guess, women in Canadian politics. And then I wanted to do something that had absolutely nothing to do with politics. So I picked the study of religion and started...
Oh, because religion's not political at all.
At all, right? And yeah, I started looking at just kind of the economic, imperial, global history of religion, and that just brought me right back into the political realm.
Yeah, I mean, for me, yeah, I joke with Laurie and Steve that actually I don't want to be here. You know, it's like
Things
what
are bad.
any good academic wants to do really is to drill deeper and narrower into and create knowledge in a very small area that only. I used to say a few thousand people, but Russell Williams at the department insists that's probably actually only 100 or so really are interested in. But I think, yeah, there is, and this is something that we've talked about, is that many of the crises we're running up against now are really serious, and there's a kind of there's a kind of necessity really to come out of that, to crawl out of that, and to engage. I mean, we're in a crisis.
So I'm a policy wonk. So I've experimented. I've been engaged, involved in so many issues. You know, municipal restructuring, health restructuring, the environment, energy, pipelines. I've also lived in different parts of the country, so I know there are very different narratives when it comes to these kinds of issues. So it's been fun. I mean, the kind of the interplay, the banter.
Well, now you've all given me fodder because I know what your specialties are, so I can pick on you and pick your brains about the last night's election. So, Dr. Laurie Lee Oates, you mentioned that you are a history and political science. They kind of come together in lots of ways. What do you think is going to be the lasting impact of this election? What is kind of new or novel or groundbreaking that happened in either the campaign or the results that we saw last night?
I'm sure you will appreciate as a lawyer that we're probably going to be spending the next 4 years talking about the Constitution. As soon as we started to see the block go up, right, it's like, oh great, that conversation again. And I think probably all the parties might be in for a leadership review. And we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about leadership and vision for the country for the next 4 years too, I think.
Yeah, when we talk about leadership and vision, sometimes I think that can detract from, although maybe they complement, but sometimes detract from the actual policy decisions. As a policy wonk, a self-described Dr. Tomblin.
What policy?
Was there enough policy? And what were the big policy issues in this election?
Well, I think that's the biggest problem. It was all about brand. It was about lack of discussion about policy issues. You know, the country is not able to talk about citizens or earth or evidence or logic or things that really matter. And I think, you know, for the most part, that was reflected in terms of that outcome. You know, for the most part, all we talk about is territory, territoriality. What does Quebec want? What does Newfoundland and Labrador want? Not what makes most sense in terms of making good decisions. So I think, you know, my challenge or problem after what happened yesterday is trying to kind of figure out how do we put it all back together? Because the country is divided, it's competitive. We're not bringing the various interests together, and I think that's a challenge going forward. And there's a lot of frustration. I don't think people feel united. They basically feel divided as a result of last night.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the policy going forward, and now that we're in a minority government, as you say, is that going to lend itself to maybe the NDP influencing more policy in the Liberal? Is it possible that this could actually lead to some kind of more discrete policy outcomes?
I think the NDP have got their mind made up that they are the balance of power. I'm not sure that the party with the most seats sees it that way. So I think we're probably in for some relationship building between the major and the minor parties.
And I think increasing over time too, there's a challenge because Ottawa lacks capacity or power. Well, for the most part, we're operating like an international system, and the provinces are basically operating in their own silos. So rather having multilateral approaches or venues for having common discussions and, you know, comparing information and so forth, for the most part, what we've done is we've created these kind of bilateral relations which are off the radar. And we don't talk about things that really matter to most people that go across borders or boundaries, because that's not how the game is designed. And so I think the most frustrating thing about this election is that the inability or the lack of capacity at the center in terms of identifying issues or problems that really matter to Canadians and coming up with some kind of idea in terms of how do we resolve them. So having an aquaculture policy that is completely opposite to what's being done here, that the Trudeau campaign talked about, we're not going to have ocean-based aquaculture. Yet here, in the other part of the country, if it's a bad policy, if it doesn't make any sense in British Columbia, why does it make sense here?
Or at least learn lessons from each other.
At least let's learn from, let's have a common conversation. At least let's not have these kind of silo-based approaches to decision
And
making.
I'm thinking us following on from that. I mean, the election that the Canadian election makes me think of and is most similar to is a European Parliament election. And when you watch a European Parliament election, what you have is you have separate jurisdictions. The parties are all linked, and they all form groups within the European Parliament. But each jurisdiction is fighting its own battle, and each jurisdiction is voting in different parties because it's different situations.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming in and making time for us on, I'm sure, is a very sleepy day for everybody who's interested in politics, staying up to late last night watching results. So thanks again, and I'll be listening to your podcast with great interest.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
Thanks for watching Out of the Fog. Hope you liked our post-election chats with Jack Harris and the founders of Podco, the hosts of that podcast. Be sure to check it out for lots more political analysis for future elections and events and lots of interesting topics. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Out of the Fog.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
With NHL Center Ice, you get a premium ticket to the games you want every night of the season. With up to 37 out-of-market games a week to choose from, you'll get more goals, more saves, more non-stop action from the teams you love. NHL Center Ice, part of the Rogers Super Sports Pack. All this for only $35.95 a month. Order through your remote on Channel 431 or call 1-888-ROGERS-1 today.
We were born in Canada. We spoke English. On the streets, we weren't welcome. But on the field, we were the assassin. Vancouver's champions. Everyone cheered for us. Our people had a voice. Then Canada declared war